Welcome everybody to this second conversation in our series on climate engagement. I'm super excited to be here with Adam Lerner, who I was lucky enough to discover through his online essay collection, I'll call it. I was calling it an online magazine, but I don't think that's the best word for it. An online essay collection called the Understory. And that was such a beautiful article I read. And then I read a bunch more and I loved them. And that's how Adam and I got in touch. So Adam is a very interesting human with a really rich background that I'm going to share a little bit with you. And then we're going to jump from there and learn more about his background and how he came to where he's at. So welcome, Adam.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here.
Okay, so you got your start in the not-for-profit sector. This is where you started your career, yeah? And then, typical to the gifted story, you did a bunch of other things, sort of related, but big jumps through your career. So you did your MBA, and then you ended up in market strategy for 15 years. And then after that, you founded Solvable, which is your current company. And that was in 2011. And then that was you doing these large group collaborations in all these different sectors. And that was going and going and going. And then 2019 came, and you said, okay, I'm changing everything. That's a really big leadership jump. To take what you built up and then say, okay, I'm taking everything I've built up over the last, how long had your career been since then? Since the beginning?
I guess it had been about 20 years. Yeah.
So it's quite the courageous jump to say, okay, so now I'm going to take everything and invest all of my time, all of my business, all of everything into the climate, into finding these regenerative solutions. So I wanted to go back to 2019 and start there in our discussion and ask you, what was that time like for you?
Thanks. I mean, the timeline that you presented makes me seem like I'm about 7 years old. Because there were a number of overlapping sequences, but as you said, there's no, like so many people, the journey was quite circuitous. It's hard to talk about the 2019 moment without talking about the journey of how I got there, but I think we'll unfold that as we get into the conversation.
Yeah.
I think that I had the incredible gift of being able to travel the world for 5 months with my family, so with my wife and 2 kids. Who were then, it was kind of the last chance to do this before my daughter entered high school. And so I closed down my current business and kept Solvable kind of on the rocks because I had both things going. And we traveled around. And I think what was, there were a number of layers to this question, which is, it made me, number one, examine what was really the thing that I wanted to be spending my time doing, because I created what seemed like, in many times leading up to that 5-month trip, an impossible break of 1,000 reasons to say no to doing that kind of trip, because life does not want I guess I was 42 or something. Life does not want a 42-year-old person to take a 5-month hiatus. Or
at least Western culture.
Totally. Yeah. There's just so many ties that have to be severed and all these things that are seemingly more important. So we made it through that. And then the question became, so what life, I think there's 2 ways to think of it. And we all face this frame, even when we take a quick vacation, right? We have these moments of being in this other space, in this kind of liminal space. And we say, well, what is it that we say how we can see the disjunction between our life that we live on a daily basis and the life that we're living in, say, a holiday destination. And oftentimes we just, we come back and just reassimilate ourselves. We pick back up on all those things, the emails we get through the email stockpile, or we don't. We get through all the bills that stacked up and all the work and all the communications, and we kind of restart. In fact, we're usually so drained by the time of that return within 3 days that whatever space we had experienced is quickly eradicated. We had the luxury, and I'm not going to say that this was so wise, because I don't think I'd do this on vacation, but we had the luxury really in the last, because of the time that we were away, to say, what is the life that we want to rebuild? And so we had, I mean, there was a number of things that we were returning to that were still here, that were kind of givens, but there was a lot that we felt like we could make decisions about. And this gave us the ability to say, what is it that we really want to be spending our time doing, and what do we want our contribution to be? And I would, obviously there's tons of signs of the climate emergency that we saw in various places around the world. There was, one of the most pristine beaches I've ever been into in my life, in Lombok, right next to Bali in Indonesia, swimming through plastic bags. There was the huge crisis when we were in South America that we particularly landed into unknowingly, in Colombia, that was getting all these Venezuelan refugees that were fleeing the crisis in Venezuela. And we could see a really an entire continent that was under a social pressure from what was happening in the implosion of one place. But I don't think there was any one particular thing that said, this is, all points to the climate emergency, but rather I had been thinking about the climate emergency for a very long time. And that started in all different ways, about thinking about my, love of the quote unquote environment, which I try to shy away from that term. But being part of the natural world, which really started for me when I was a teenager. And then coming back into a reverence of a moment, realizing how the gravity of the situation, that I guess, I started to read more things. But I think it was really, for me, it was because I had spent so much time in the corporate world. It was starting to see the cascading commitments of what was happening in the corporate landscape. And there was a kind of a way, what I still believe, even though a lot of it, is now disproven, that there was actually true intention there. I do think that there was a broader awakening that I was a part of, that was starting to happen that summer and in the previous couple of years, that I think is only radically escalated since then. So that's a very long answer to your question.
Yeah, but it's an interesting one, because it's something we talked about as well privately, that this was when I was really like, okay, I can't keep waking up and just doing my life as though nothing was going on. I love the gifted world and I like my work supporting gifted people, but I can't just wake up and do gifted courses and teach gifted psychology and then go to sleep and feel good about myself. I mean, I really have to be completely engaged, and that's really when that shift was happening. And it's so interesting talking to all of these different people, different climate coaches and climate experts around the world, since I've started to get involved in this. And it's like, for a lot of us, it was this wake up around 2018. Even interestingly, people who were engaged in climate work before. So like next week, I'm talking with Sarah Birch, who's the climate coach in South Africa. And she was doing, she was doing climate like coaching in the government. And she said, even for her, it was, sort of a cognitive exercise. We'll be talking about it with her, but even people who were in it, she's just one example. Like, it was right around 2018 that was like, okay, I can't just talk about this anymore. I can't just cognate about it. It needs to be something really fundamental to the way that I structure my life. So it is really interesting that it was happening for you at the same time, but I think it was happening for a lot of people. And as you said, like, there was a whole sort of movement, a shift that was going on around.
And that was the fall of the climate strikes, that the biggest climate strikes in that September, right? Yeah. As well, which I think is not, I don't think it was necessarily for me the sensing that there was a movement there, because I knew that there was a movement there for a very long time. And I really felt that because I was a part of it. It was it was seeing my kids involved in that movement, and also their particularly my daughter kind of asking me what was my contribution. And it was funny because I started to do some things like hosting dinners that were, around climate conversations. She's like, that's not doing anything. Like, you're not really, just you're not talking with people isn't doing anything, which is, I hope at one point in time she'll look back on my coaching career and say that I was actually doing something. But to a 13 or 14-year-old kid, sitting around talking doesn't seem like you're actually doing anything to solve the problem.
Yeah, fair enough. So when in this process did you decide to become a climate coach?
Yeah, it's an interesting, I still will define myself as a climate coach with a lowercase c.
Yeah, fine.
And what
Which I totally get. But in terms of studying it as a discipline, I guess. Is what I'm thinking.
So I wanted to figure out how I could emerge into being more assistive on the human journey side. So I wanted to understand, I'd spent a lot of time, as you alluded to in my bio, thinking about how messages are constructed. That is what a marketer does. You think about your audience and you think about how am I going to convince them to do whatever this thing is that I'm trying to get them to do. That is largely a removed experience. I mean, now it does have a real-time aspect because of the social presencing of kind of what happens in marketing and brand, but it's not dialogic. So you're not in a space that is kind of continually emergent in the way that you are in being in a coaching relationship with a group of people or individuals. So I really wanted to learn how do I personally move through? And I think that probably starts with, for a lot of people that do coaching, is how do I move through this space? And then how do I help others to move through it? And I don't mean move through it like a linear trajectory, because there is no linearity. In fact, one of the things that I've learned is that, around something like grief, is that we're in these kind of continuous cycles, and that's informed by the work of Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, and it's informed by Joanna Macy's work. And so if we start to understand that we have these continual returnings instead of that we're on some journey and it's like, oh yeah, I kind of did the grief thing back there and I've kind of moved along. I think that was really helpful. So I wanted to really learn how to be more assistive in the journey with others, and the kind of human qualities of thinking about the emotional context and the cultural context by which we were engaging or largely choosing not to engage with the climate emergency.
Yeah, I mean, and I can't imagine you doing your corporate work without that element. I mean, or I can, but I can imagine that forms of denial could persist, let's say.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's we still are hesitant to always talk about what we do in the corporate space as a coaching engagement, and so we've started to talk about experiment with different language, and so we talk about it in things like learning journeys. So those are not just rational, knowledge-based cognitive journeys. They're also emotional and journeys of the heart. So we're using the idea of a learning journey, capital L, capital J, more expansively than what, say in an academic context, you might talk about the learning journey for a student. Or so I think that this is kind of that happy medium that we're trying to find, which is the space of emerging into a new way of understanding that involves both the head and the heart.
Yeah.
As Adam would say. Yeah.
Yeah. And I wish all learning journeys included, like, childhood education and stuff included that.
Yes.
Yeah, that would be the ideal.
Yes. Well, you're talking with Elizabeth. She'll crack that one for you.
Yeah, true. I'm looking forward. So something you said in the talk with Chris Gaither, who is another coach, and we'll link to the talk so that anybody that wants to have a listen, which I recommend the talk, it's quite lovely. Then we'll link it in the comments on our Facebook live here. But something you talked about with him was this move from a consultant role, which you were in for so many years, and then moving to a coaching role, or let's say more coaching spirited role, and the sort of shift from being required to be the smartest person in the room, and then having to kind of go into that vulnerability and that space of emergence that coaching requires. And I've heard as a coach for I've been coaching since I was 24, as I've heard many times over the years, coaching is so sort of easy. It's kind of you can just sort of be there and bounce ideas. And I always think, no, not if you're doing the job right. It's so much about being in that emergent space and being in that vulnerable position that says, I don't know, but I'm here and I have tools, and we can use those tools to help you find out and then to take action on it. And I think coming from, and I've done other consulting work as well, where it's not so, you don't have to be in such that emergent space. You come in, you say, you do have to see what the situation is, but then you give your expert advice and they implement, and that's that. So there is so much more, I think, of a heart dimension to the coaching role. And I can imagine how combining these things in the work that you do in corporations, organizations, networks and stuff, that this brings that out. It also made me think of the gifted aspect, when you have the gifted mind and you grew up gifted, and we'll talk about that in a bit, and you are used to sort of showing that off in a certain way. Whether that's intentional or not, but when you're in a consulting role and you're coming in, you're being the smartest one in the room, you get used to a certain sort of dynamic. And then when you come in as a coach, that's not appropriate to show off in that way. And it takes, your intelligence will show up clearly, but it will show up in a very different, much more sort of co-creative manner. So that I can imagine having been quite a shift as well. I'm curious if that brings up any recollections for you.
Well, I should first say that I'm learning how to sit in those spaces all the time and become more emergent, because it's not something that naturally I do, and nor have I spent a lot of my career in that mode. Mm-hmm. So I have huge degrees of mentorship with it's one of the things that I was so excited to connect with you about and learn, how much I've learned from you. Obviously, my colleagues May Bartlett and Charles Holmes are continue to be mentors for me on a daily basis, and what we're doing in the work as we approach it collectively in Solvable. But I also feel incredibly lucky to have this network of coaches around the world that I'm in constant communication with. Sometimes we're in groups, sometimes we're in individual communication, because there is such a sharing. And you were remarking before we started the call about this kind of egoless approach to this work. And I'm so grateful for those relationships, because I continue to learn and feel supported by so many people in the community, of which I know you're connected and even speaking with some in these conversations. And so I think we're learning how to do this. One of the things that I felt conflicted about, and I think I shared that in the conversation with Chris, was just that because I didn't come through a formal coaching trajectory, I kind of ended up coaching senior executives, not, as with a lowercase c. This whole idea of not having an agenda or advocating for a position is something that is kind of core to the coaching profession, but it's something that I pushed against and continue to push against. And so one of the people that I have, learnned a lot from and trained with was Charlie Cox, and we're still in close touch and admire greatly. And she talks about how the good thing about doing climate change coaches is the title was you advocated through the brand, so you didn't have to advocate in the session.
So it's true.
He knew what you stood for. And I
Yeah.
think that was, to some degree, that's true for us too, is that we are very clear about the space that we're working on. But, and I don't know if this is too much of a divergence from where you want to go at this point in the conversation. I think it's also very easy to fall into the pattern, and we have had to pull ourselves out of this, that you were in a coaching and emergent space around climate, but you're not actually having impact on the problem.
Mm.
And so, and this is one of the things Chris and I were talking about, because we have very different kind of ways of engaging. And I think that there's so many different contributions for all of us, but I think it does need to come back to impact. And if we're serious about the climate emergency, we need to be constantly evaluating how are we having an impact on the outcomes of this future that we're trying to create. And that's a hard question, but I think it's one, as coaches and anyone working the space, we need to constantly be asking ourselves, is this question of true impact?
Yeah, agreed. I mean, and this comes back to something that we talked about in our previous discussions in terms of ecosystemic leadership. So this idea that, you're not just doing coaching so you can feel better about the climate. I mean, that's just not how it works. It's not one of those things that you just feel better about it in the corner of your room, and that's good enough. It really is an interconnected thing. And so I think anybody that's doing climate coaching is doing ecosystemic leadership, because it is a plugged in thing. I mean, we are climate, our bodies are climate. This is, you can't sort of ignore the ecosystemic aspect to it. And so approaching it that way, I think, helps differentiate it from something that's more insular and just about, me as a client. I want to feel better about it. I want to process things. I mean, even, we could even say that some of that gets just into therapy. I mean, therapy is there to help people get back to, sometimes we say neutral. So, you get back to mentally okay or emotionally okay, but it's not there. I mean, coaching is that next thing that's like, okay, now how do you have impact? How do you take this and really go beyond just surviving and just doing okay to thriving and making an impact and stuff. So to a degree, I think it's built into the coaching model, the modality itself is designed for that, but I mean, it's practiced in all sorts of different ways, and sometimes it can turn insular if one isn't vigilant about it.
Yeah, I had shared this in one of my Understory posts. Actually, it was the first piece that I wrote. Martin Luther King Jr., when he was writing his letter from a Birmingham jail, talked about the cup of endurance. The quote was, "There comes a time when the cup of endurance runs over and men are no longer willing to be plunged into the abyss of despair." And what I think is this metaphor of the cup of endurance and that flowing over is that we are both dealing with in coaching practice those who the cup has already overflowed, but we are also helping to overflow the cup. And so that is the relationship between what I'm doing, in the work, say, for instance, in the coaching work and the things that we're doing on the learning journeys, and what the Understory is trying to do in the background is we are trying to make sure that the cup of endurance doesn't just stay right below the threshold, and therefore it results in no action. And I think we have to be really careful that in the coaching practice too, that we can serve as that kind of band-aid or reparative device that enables someone to cope just well enough that they can endure the inequalities of the moral injury or all these things that they're starting to awaken into. And I think that that's what we're learning as coaches, is how to find that kind of sweet spot in the climate space, which is to say that you should feel grief, you should feel anger, you should feel love, you should feel despair, you should feel hope, you should feel all of these things, and they intermix into this into these relationships, these emotional relationships, with our feeling of connection with the larger world, that are absolutely imperative for bridging across that separation that at least I had been largely brought up in from greater living systems. And so,
yeah, absolutely. And like when I'm doing training for coaches, this is often what I'm talking about. Like, you're not helping a person to just endure things. And you know, I mean, you know this because we've talked about it privately, and anybody in the gifted space probably knows about the Dubrowski theory of positive disintegration, which is really, there are these sort of different levels of integration of your values and of your personality into your actions. And there's sort of this one place where you kind of start to switch from what he called multi-level development and directed multi-level development, or I think it was spontaneous multi-level development and directed. And the directed, so the spontaneous is like maybe something bad happens to you, and then you have the tools to reintegrate into even a higher level, maybe, you know. So I don't know, you have an accident in the family, and then you grieve, and you you reintegrate at a higher level. But the multi-level development really speaks to this more coaching mentality that's like, you look for, to a degree, you look for hardship, not unnecessarily, and you don't want to traumatize yourself, but you look for the things that are going to push you toward your edges, without pushing yourself off violently or something. But you push yourself toward your edges, and so you find these moments. And to a degree, I mean, that kind of connects back to some of like the Buddhist mentality around, like, that you kind of look like maybe contemplating death, or contemplating things that you wouldn't necessarily want to contemplate, but yet you actually start to want to contemplate them, because they bring you to an edge, and they bring you beyond what is just surviving. So there's a certain creativity that's generated when you're at that edge. And so, seeking out, you don't want, again, it's kind of this weird thing where you don't want to say, well, I'm seeking out suffering so that I can be a better person or something. But there's an element to that. And, in a lot of mindfulness practice, there is that element about really being with suffering and not running away from it, and almost embracing it gratefully, because it will bring you to an edge that you would not have found otherwise. And a lot of people say this, who have been through serious trauma, that their trauma, or let's say severe illness, or sometimes near-death experience or something, that these things bring them beyond an edge that they would have never gotten beyond had it not been for that thing, and that it ends up being this source of great creativity in their life, and connection, and depth, and this sort of profound, aliveness. So it's quite interesting that it pulls us there. This coaching thing pulls us there. Yeah.
I love the description about edges, and being pulled to the edges, and this significance of that, and this scariness of it for many people are fearful of going to those edges, but that I think that it is the fruitful space that we need to spend our time in. And I mean, per what the reference to Buddhism and the relationship to suffering, and Thich Nhat Hanh talking about reality, the pictures of reality, and our continuous ability to see reality, and really confront reality. And I think that that's something that we're hugely facing, and most of us, as I referenced in our previous conversation, insulate ourselves from that reality, because it helps protect ourselves from the moral harm that we're actually causing on the world. That it becomes difficult to bear when you see a complete picture of reality, and then try to reconcile your life, and then you have to ask yourself some very hard questions, and you need the spaces and the people around you to be able to go into those hard questions and really sit there, sometimes for quite a long time.
Yeah. And being gifted, having the gifted mind that's able to sit with these complexities and not reduce them, to false binaries. That's something really powerful and important. Something we talked about in our previous conversations was like the responsibility of a gifted person at this moment in time, and in terms of engagement with the climate, engagement in leadership, and the ecological domain. And it's we can't be prescriptive and we can't be normative about every gifted person and what they should do. But since we're having this discussion about bringing people to their edges, why don't we go there? Why don't we go to the edge of that question? Something you said, and I loved it. Like I could put it as a quote sort of on my wall or something. Is and now I'll probably misquote what you exactly said, but it was basically something like I refuse to be a reductionist, and so you're like, I sit with the complexities, and that's something that I will do, like as a protest against these kinds of false binaries. And so I think that's something that's wonderful that you can bring to the leadership, that you do bring to your leadership, your particular, let's say, brand of leadership, if we want to call it that. And yet not everybody can do that. And so we talked about, like, what do you do as a gifted person when you can and other people can't? Not all other people, but there are some people that's really difficult for them. It's just really difficult for them to sit with, to sort of understand all of those complexities, to see all of them, because it takes some abstraction. I mean, like you're saying, if you're going to really look at the full the full view of reality, and you're going to see what you're doing to the world and that you're causing your own harm, that takes a level of abstraction that a lot of people struggle to do. Just simply, it's just a cognitive limitation. It's not right or wrong. It's just that they're struggling to do it. So there's kind of two questions there, which is like, how do you persist in doing that meaningfully as a person with a gifted mind, who's really able to see those abstractions, to see those complexities, and to sit with them, and somewhat comfortably, relatively speaking, let's say, because you're doing that as a choice. It's not like you're being forced to, right? And so how do you practice that and like develop work around that, for example, in a world where not everybody can do that? So that's the first question. And then the second question is, what do you recommend for people who do struggle with that, who struggle with those abstractions? Like, how can they engage with these questions? Because they are important questions, and everybody does need to engage with them. But is there something that you, from your experience, and you've worked with so many people over the years, I'm sure you've run into the different types, along the scale of the complexity capacities.
Big questions.
Yeah, I know.
So let's
feel free to say pass, and then I'll just jump to the next one.
No, it's great. So I think the first piece is that I look at it as so there's an innate capacity, and then there's the ability to train our minds. Those are relational, but they're actually distinctive things. So I think one of the projects that I have embarked on, particularly in the past couple of years, is a very deliberate training of my mental capacities. And realizing that a lot of what we see, I think, in our external environment, that is the reductionist solutionism that is involved in so much of, whether it's marketing language, whether it's public policy, et cetera, is done because it's done for convenience, and I think that it's more expeditious. It asks less of people. It asks less of each of us, and I think that this is why I feel like you made it. I should have had a T-shirt or something made about being a reduction, not refusing to be a reductivist. I think the difference is when I think about it quite often, about when I started to really invest in understanding indigenous cosmologies, they seemed so complex to me. Like they were, because the cosmologies were so entirely foreign. And and so I was having to relearn a worldview that at the same time was trying to understand a worldview that was here and be able to and evaluate my own worldview, and then have to say, well, where do these mesh, and what do I do now, or what is that emergent space that's coming out? And both of those activities, which are the being able to really understand and sit with the complexities of other worldviews that are not our own, and understand them really on their terms, even if they're not our culture, and they're certainly not our cultural conditioning. And then the second one is being able to really take a look at what is the conditioning, what I call the decolonizing of our mind.
Yes.
That we have to then ask ourselves the very hard questions about our own assumptions about the world, that really breaks apart our own cosmologies. And then you deal with the reintegration piece. And this is going into the edges conversation, which is that reintegration piece is very uncomfortable, because people often worry that they're not going to be able to pick up the parts. Like, I've just shattered the mirror, and I worry that I'm never going to be able to put it back together again. Or how do I reconcile, the lifestyle that I live with, flying on planes and driving cars and doing business in a way that isn't necessarily contributing to the health of the planet? How do I reconcile these things if I then, have a new cosmology that is adapted from looking at other ways of knowing and being in this world? Whoa, those are hard choices to make. So I think that the first place that, in terms of practice, is the invitation to really sit with other ways of knowing and being. And that's where, at least for me, that's what I started with. And I think that it takes time. I mean, there's often things that I will read and I'll have to come back to it a year or two later and see it a different way. I mean, we do this in all kinds of ways in our life. I mean, I think about it I remember when in like 1998, I was listening to an interview with Tom York from Radiohead, and he was saying, I think the best band in the world right now is not Radiohead, it's this band called Sigur Rós, Icelandic band. So I rush out and I get the CD of Sigur Rós, of their first album, and I put it in, and I am just like, absolutely, like, I don't get it. Like, this is not resonating. I listened to a few songs. I probably played the CD through a couple times. And then 2 or 3 years later, something inspired me to put it back in. And what I heard was entirely different. And sure, I may have also been in a different space to be able to hear it at that time. But the complexity, I wasn't ready for the complexity. And so I think that what's really a valuable practice is to be able to be in that space of non-judgment, which is also something I'm working very hard to train myself against, which is to say, like, okay, I don't get it, but instead of being in the place of like, Sigur Rós is not a great band, instead you say, I don't get it, and that's on me, and let's see if I can return to it. And so that it's that returning back for things when we're ready. And I think people in the kind of indigenous cosmologies, that's where somebody like Robin Wall Kimmerer has proved very fruitful for a lot of people, because she provided an easy access point. People kind of got it in a non-threatening way, and she did a great job of making something that is quite complex seem simple, because you were talking about a strawberry. So I think that it's about finding, it's really committing to a longer journey and saying, like, it's not about picking up this one book and all of a sudden I've like rattled, I've explored new edges and I've like transformed as an individual, but rather it's committing to a process of continuous re-examination and learning, and knowing that I might come back, I can come back to that thing that is still there, and those choices are still there, and those options are still there. And I think that this is where, on the other side, I've run against this challenge around time, and this is why I wrote an issue on the contours of time that integrated Marcia Bjornrod's work and Andre Snare Magnuson's work on time and water, because we've got a fixed timeline, and 2030 is an arbitrary number, but it works for science. You got to have some model for analysis. So we have this space that is our expansive space, and this kind of individual and collective transformational journey, but it needs to happen on a timeline now, because the exponential problem of where we are at with exponential carbon that is built up in the atmosphere, and now we have to exponentially de-escalate it. And so therefore, if we don't do that in a timely fashion, it become the challenges to be able to overcome that become truly insurmountable. And so this is where I think we have this difficult space as climate coaches, particularly, which is we're there for the long journey, but we also need to hurry it up. So, and I think that is something that is, I don't have the answers to. And so I write into some of these questions because I want to explore the possible ways of understanding and dealing with complexities, rather than saying let's fixate on 2030, or time doesn't matter. And, this is all a, billions of year journey as part of the Earth system, right?
Yeah. Well, and that's what I love about your writing in the Understory, because as we've talked about before, it's so multi-layered, and there are so many nested concepts within. And I mean, there are plenty of abstractions, and there's a lot of complexity, but there are also there's also this simpler thread that runs through that allows engagement, I think, from almost any point of view. It's this really lovely balance between these two, and it was particularly why with you I would enjoy discussing this topic, in terms of how do you manage that kind of line between the complexity and the abstraction, and sitting with that almost as a revolt or something, as a statement, as a life statement, and then working with just the more grounded isn't the right word, but the simpler binaries. And I think as you're talking about tuning into the time aspect is really important, and even realizing that there are different sort of versions of time, and there's different time scales, and we have to honor the various time slices in which all of these different things are happening. And I mean, you and I both know that from working with individuals. When you work with an individual, you cannot rush a person's process. You can help them get to their edges. You can help you can help the cup overflow and everything, but you can't rush the situation. I mean, we all take our time to process things the way we do. I took it felt like a terribly long time through my climate grief process. I thought, when on earth am I ever going to get out of this? It's terrible. I would just cry and think, what on earth? How did I end up here? And I have some, childhood trauma that played into why that was so terrible for me. But in any case, it felt interminable. And you said also in your conversation with Chris Gaither that it took you a long while to get through the grief, and that even with the Understory, it took you 13 issues to be able to talk about it. So you talked about it in the 14th issue. And even there, it's clear in reading through, it's not like you had the whole thing figured out at that point. It's just that was the first moment that you were able to talk about it publicly. And so I wanted to talk about that, sitting with these complexities and sitting with this very non-binary reality of life, which includes all of these very personal emotions that take a lot of time. What was that like for you? What was your way of navigating that process?
So I'll start with the hurriedness of life was an excuse to simplify. So for quite a long time, especially with young children and going in, working a lot and family responsibilities and friends and all these other things, they became an excuse to say, like, I don't have time to deal with the complexity over here because I need to be able to like check the box off in order to manage all of the kind of influx of different responsibilities in my life because time doesn't allow for it. So I have to say that, like, if this is something that a lot of people ask me about the time management piece, like, how do you manage time? And so I think that being able to create some expansiveness for ourselves is absolutely imperative. That if we don't have control, obviously I have my own company, and so I, to some degree, control my schedule, although we have clients and everything, but I can control, if there's certain things that I can control versus in a lot of stages of my career when I was working for other people and they set the times that I needed to be there. And there were significant cultural expectations there. I think that if we can look at our lives and say we don't actually have time in our lives in order to deal with any complexity, then that is the examination point to say something really needs to change. Because a hurried life that doesn't enable us that forces us into binary positions is going to be a less rewarding life for us. And it's also not going to be the way that we ended up in those edges that you talk about that result in us taking more transformative action for us, but also for the greater health of the living planet. So if we can't conquer at least a little slice of that and create that openness, then I think we're going to be really challenged to be able to deal with any complexity. I think I strayed from originally what you wanted to ask about.
No, actually, I mean, maybe you strayed in your mind, but it does answer the question, because the question is really, how did you get through this grief process? And I mean, I could really answer it almost the same way. Like, I just kept giving it time. Like, even when everything and felt like every cell in my body was saying there's no time. Did you see the latest IPCC report? There is no time, and then I was like, I mean, but I've been doing this work for all these years. I studied as a psychologist. Like, I'm aware there has to be the time there has to be. And if I die in the grief process, well, I die in the grief process because grief is what it is, and it takes its own time. And it was, I just can't imagine passing through that, or as much as I've passed through. I mean, it's not like I'm, immune or something, but that big first phase where everything just felt impossible, passing through that, it wouldn't have happened if I hadn't been able to give it time. And I mean, I would credit what I cultivated before that in allowing myself to give me that time. And in my case, and I'm curious what you would say about that took a lot of trauma healing, because I had a lot of childhood trauma that I had to work through. And that took a lot of mindfulness, like deep mindfulness practice. And without those two things, I don't know. I can't imagine what would be sitting here right now. I wouldn't be sitting here right now. I don't know where I'd be, but I wouldn't be sitting here right now having this conversation with you.
Yeah, I mean, I really needed other practices that enabled me to sit with that grief in a different way. And as I think I certainly spoke to in the piece, I'm really indebted to Megan Sheldon and Kate Love for their course, Becoming Ceremonial, which really provided a ritual space that opened up new ways of understanding and considering both, looking at my own life, but also looking at the systems around us. And so I needed to be brought into that space. In fact, I was quite reluctant to go into that space because it was highly uncomfortable. And it still is something that is not intuitive to me. But I think that it's the same point that I was making about camera, which is we need multiple gateways. We need many different possible openings. And those openings are going to create more expansiveness for some of us at a certain point than they will for others, or at that point in your life. And so for me, it was that course, taking it then, was really instrumental in opening me up to a set of practices that was cultivating my capacity to really be able to sit with the grief. And I think that, and part of that was sitting in grief with others. I mean, it was not just, it needed to be socialized, which I think was really important. And it was strange and lovely and scary all at the same time.
Yeah.
But I think this cultivation of capacity is really the key piece. And it goes back into the gifted piece, which is, I was really fortunate that, I was anointed as this gifted kid, that therefore it conferred upon me certain privileges that other people didn't have structurally, systemically. And it enabled me to build capacity because other people were there nurturing it around me, for me, and creating those spaces that I was brought into. So while the rest of starting in grade 2, well, the majority of the other kids, around 20 kids, sat in the class, wrote, learning, I got to be off in this other space called CLUE, Creative Learning for a Unique Environment, with a small group of other kids who got to be in a totally different learning space with a different learning style and in small group settings. And that's privilege. I mean, that is privilege into a certain degree. Is, I don't know if you want to go there. It, for me, where I grew up, was white privilege. And so I didn't see it. And I certainly don't think that there was a decision there from my parents when they were saying, oh, should Adam and my sister later did the same program, should they be in this program? Because what is this program actually perpetuating systemically? And what are the privileges that enable our child to have different capacities within cultivated that other kids don't get? Even though my parents would have said it was absolutely a deliberate decision for them to send me to a private school, a public school versus a private school, because they didn't want me to be in that privileged environment, which many white kids were in Memphis, where I grew up, because they wanted me to be part of the broader social systems, because in so many ways we weren't integrated. I mean, we lived in a largely white neighborhood, even though the city is majority Black. And so I think how we deal with this and reconcile and are aware of privilege. And I shared something last week that a friend in Montreal, Lorraine Smith, wrote on privilege, where she was kind of on Truth and Reconciliation Day here in Canada. She was really noting the amount of privilege that she had. This is part of our cultivation of our capacity. And I don't think that we need, there's different ways that are available to everyone to cultivate, but I think that they will look very different depending on as you described, like what trauma we're trying to work through and what conditions we find ourselves in.
Yeah. And I think that those of us who got some version of privilege growing up, to a degree, I mean, I feel a lot of joy and an emotion that's hard to describe in an actual word, but let's call it joy. And then there's something else pleasant and positive about that. I feel that when I can use what came out of that privilege in a way that that gives back, pays back somehow to somebody who didn't have that, and having that bond and that connection in the moment now, I think is very healing for both parties. Because I didn't, I was a child as well. I was in the magnet program, not the CLUE program. That you know.
Exactly the same thing. Yeah.
But it might be interesting for listeners to know we both grew up in the US, both in gifted programs, and then we both ended up moving out of the US as adults. Kind of a funny coincidence.
Yes.
But, you know, and then to a degree, some people would say, well, gifted education is absolutely not a privilege because it's you know, it's what the gifted brain needs, and the gifted person is going to suffer terribly if they don't get that kind of enrichment or that kind of next level education. So I think it's a complex question in itself, but I think there is, obviously, when we look at the situation, especially where you grew up in Memphis, yeah, I mean, there's a clear privilege aspect to it. And that's something to really be considered when we think about how the past that we're bringing to these questions.
Yes.
Yeah. And also for me, like, I mean, my parents paid for me to go to university to study. Like, I got to do that. I got to study psychology. If I hadn't studied psychology, how would I have processed what went on for me?
Yes.
I would have had the tools. It's hard to imagine, you know. So these kind of reflections are, I think, important in the process, like looking back and going, what do the privileges that I had, how did they help me process this? And how do I give that back? How do I pay that back to other people around me, to other people who didn't have those privileges? And that's, of course, not to put myself in some sort of savior role or something. I mean, that would be a whole other, you know, a whole other dysfunctional path. I don't mean it like that at all. But just, you know, realistic ecosystemic engagement in that sense.
Yes. It
and
creates responsibilities. It creates responsibilities, and what I often think of as kind of a network of reciprocal relationships, so that
exactly,
it's not about apologizing. I mean, the acknowledgement is important, and the conversation in preparing for this helped me acknowledge that part of my past, which I really hadn't thought very much about in this way. But it's not about now, like that's not what is needed, is just an apologetic response. It's to say, what are the responsibilities that are conferred upon me because of the privileges that I have had, and also the things that others have given me, the ways that others have supported me, the way, you know, all of the things that have enabled me to be who I am in the privileged position that I sit in. That creates responsibilities, and it creates opportunities for reciprocity that we need to be really mindful of in the ways that we go through even our everyday actions. So, and you know, an apology is not a reciprocal it's not a reciprocal relationship. So I think that it's a challenging one, because I think that we grew up in probably what is the country that has the most significant narrative of exceptionalism of the individual, that everything is, you know, it's not that this doesn't exist in Canada and Switzerland and other places. It certainly exists in many different countries around the world. But I think that we, particularly in the US, there's such a strong narrative around exceptionalism. And I think that because it's conditional in this relationship of like, oh, well, if we were, you know, if the gift, you know, say the gifted mind, and we're going to let the gifted mind atrophy, and that's damage to them, because that person could eventually make some very large contribution. They could be the president of the United States. That was always the one that was held up, right? If you don't nurture the gifted kids, you're going to have like removed the potential for them to become the next leader of this country. And there is this just incredibly damaging cycle of exceptionalism that's there, particularly in the US narrative, but it's there in most neoliberal narratives now, that I think that is something that we really have to figure out how to escape, and is actually totally intertwined with why we're in the climate situation that we're in.
Oh yeah, that points to like one of the, you know, major bullet points of the whole situation. Why are we here?
Yes.
I love that you brought up the narrative aspect, because that's a big part of your work and something I wanted to, you know, invite you to reflect on together. You mentioned before about like, you know, kind of it's your goal, or I don't know, it's your work to decolonize your mind. And prior, when we spoke about it, you used the word imagination, so decolonizing your imagination. And your writing through the understory is very much geared toward that, the decolonization of the imagination, which I think is again, we could have another t-shirt, I think, with that on it. And this is really important, because something you said was that even climate engaged people don't necessarily have a sustainable vision for the future, a sustainable narrative to work with. And that really, I mean, it points to this big problem that we have around the narratives, both in what we were just talking about these narratives of human exceptionalism, and in how we construct our next narratives that don't have this nonsense and these binaries built in, so I'm curious, how does that come up in your work, and how do you work with it with people rewriting the narrative, or at least generating new narratives that make sense? I mean, I know that's really the core of your work.
Yeah, thank you. I'll just to solidify in the one quote, which many people are probably familiar with, Thomas Berry said, "We're in trouble now not because we don't have a good story, but because we are between stories." And I think that if we start to evaluate our position that we are between stories, it opens up the possibilities of seeing ahead and also seeing behind, in the integration of those two things, where instead of seeing them as some linear piece, they're loops. And so we are now, what I really see because I'm trained as a historian, and that's my passion, is that when I look back through the history, through historic writing, and that could be an indigenous writer, it could be an economist, it could be somebody who wrote a novel, it could be a psychologist. What we often see is that there are abandoned narratives that we chose to, and Foucault's work was largely based on this whole idea, right? That we will choose the thread that is most convenient to our narrativization of the moment that we choose to support. So we have discarded, take somebody like Milton Friedman, we have discarded anything to do with Milton Friedman, other than this notion of that he advocated for shareholder capitalism, not thinking about the historic context that he was trying to battle off the Cold War and create a position for the United States that was distinctive from communism, and all of the other things that he said. And similar to the butcher and the baker comment from Adam Smith, like, we don't look at what he was actually saying in Wealth of Nations. We have chosen to a certain slice of a narrative that conveniently fits with the cultural condition that we're trying to validate. And so what I find really rewarding is being able to go back and pull through voices that are the abandoned slices, and the ones that we chose conveniently to ignore because they didn't fit with our desired narrative. So that is that's why the understory and a lot of my writing will always be situated around the voices, historic voices, because I think that we tend to think, especially in the techno age that we live in, we tend to think that we so prize the disruptive and the new that we tend to not only do we cover over what was the old, but we have entirely invalidated the idea that there was that we have lineage, that whether it's ancestral relations and the ties that bind, we have severed those because we want to support the idea that we are creating something anew, and aren't we geniuses for doing that in this moment? So I think that there's a great deal to be, I can spend the rest of my life going through the knowledge, and it's accumulating more every day of what I am able to bring forward. But I also think it's very important to bring it through in the voices and the lexicons of either that culture or that time. This is why somebody like Paul Kingsnorth is so interesting in his work, because why he decided to write the Wake in some like kind of invented 13th century Anglo language was because he realized that the ways in which we express ideas are just as important as the ideas that are being expressed themselves.
Right.
And so therefore language becomes incredibly important as a relational device to understanding. And so I think that being able to bring through the voices, and especially because a lot of our history has been oral histories, and those were told in stories, which I should say, this is one of the things, and we talked about this very briefly in our conversation. It is really something that I have tried to work hard on, that is not my natural disposition, to gravitate towards story. And because we know through all of the research, and I'll take the analytical lens on it, we know through the research that it is through stories that we create new understanding, and that those openings for most people become wider. And so I know that it is imperative in the writing that I do, even though I don't necessarily want to write long stories, that story is very much incorporated and often front-ended into a piece as the invitation in, because that is the way that we've come to understand. And that's part of that. Would go back to the reference that you were making before about me being the smart, supposedly being paid to be the smart person at the front of the room telling people what they should do. As a strategist, it was always about telling story, and so we needed to figure out a way that was going to create the story of the future that they wanted to move into, rather than whatever conditional present they found themselves in. And I think that that's very much true of our work now, is we need those spaces for bringing through those stories. And that is also something that relates to time, because we don't have time for those stories. Right. That's why, yeah. We just give me the, you mentioned something which I thought was really cool about listening to podcasts even faster than the recorded speed. I hope you don't mind me sharing that. And so
no, that's fine. It's one of my techniques.
Yeah, which is really, really cool. And we have to, how do we cope with this scarcity of time in being able to hear the voices, hear the narratives, hear the stories, decolonize our minds in the space that we have, in the time that we have. And I think that that's, we all have our different ways of coping with that. But I think a lot of people struggle to have the space for any stories in their life, because they're not fast enough. And so we read headlines and as a way of understanding, which is just degenerative to cultural understanding. Yeah.
And one of the reasons that you started with long form, I mean, that you chose long form as a way of writing with Understory, was to combat that. And also, I mean, as it links to what you're talking about, you had, maybe you didn't use the word combat, but you had basically said to the effect that you're combating cultural amnesia, this kind of, great forgetting of what has come before. And, as a woman, for example, I find it really wonderful that there are so many people unearthing things that women said along the way and bringing that back. And it, if we think about like the nonlinearity of time, that means so much to me and my younger self, and the little gifted girl that, thought, okay, well, I got this big mind that does all these things, but I guess I just have to get married and have kids and cook in the kitchen. So getting over this cultural amnesia is a really important thing, but we do need to have the time for it, which means we need to slow down, which means, all of these things that we're talking about, we have to really push ourselves to our edges, and do whatever pre-work has to be done to be comfortable going to our edges. Because if we're triggered, at our edges and when we're getting into dysregulated states, nervous system states, well, that's no good either. So it's like finding that way. And I love, before when you were talking about grief, that you steered the conversation toward the collective aspect of grief, because whether it's grief or eco-anxiety or healing from trauma or whatever whatever you're going through emotionally, that connection aspect is so essential, because we are all doing this together. And this was one of the reasons I wanted to do these live conversations, because, getting together and talking about these things from where we're at, we're not at the end of the journey. We're just like at somewhere on the path. I mean, is there even an end? I don't know. But, it's like we're somewhere along the path, and just being able to talk about that with each other has already been very meaningful for us respectively. And so I think it's cool to see that collective aspect, so now, and we're doing it now, and we've done it in different ways in the past that have included more, like you did the course for ritual, like bringing ritual into it. You did this kind of collective thing, and I spent hours and weeks and months and years now with my collaborator Karen Eglinton, and also my husband Aurélien, like talking about these things and crying and in figuring it out along the way. And there's that, so there's this local thing, and then there's like the next circle out, like things we did to be able to get here. And then there's the cultural amnesia aspect, that's like getting out of that and decolonizing the mind and realizing that we do come from this whole rich background of, I don't want to call it support, because again, that kind of gets to the exceptionalism point, like me and my need for support, but just again, realizing how nested we are in the ecosystems, not only the local, but the ecosystems of time throughout time. And I think that that's really powerful, this aspect of the work that you bring into it. It also, I think just by nature is kind of, it makes your work raw in a good way. That's it, it's like a bit, there's a sandpaper aspect to your work. As well, there should be, I think, to anybody who's doing coaching. Again, finding ways to make the cup overflow. But I think that's really powerful. I mean, that challenges somebody to say, am I really committed to this? Am I really in this? Am I going to do the hard work that it takes to have the big rewards? Because the rewards are so big, when we really commit to the process. I mean, being on the other side of this, I would never go back. Like, I would never go back and do it differently. Being on the other side, I'm like, wow. I mean, the amount of connection with nature, the amount of, I struggle to say this because I realize I am nature. So whenever I say this, it feels weird, but just for the sake of our discussion, the connection with nature, the connection with other people who are completely like in love with the planet and in love with all of the living systems, and are doing everything that they can to protect and champion that. And people who are in love with life through time, and in love with this kind of generative emergence that they're making space for and showing. So like through your work, that part of that thread shows up, and that's a really beautiful thing.
Yeah, that's lovely. Thank you. I love the sandpaper piece. I'll remember that one. That'll stick. Thank you. I think that one of the things, before you were asking the coaching question quite a while ago about kind of how I got into coaching or chose coaching as the path, there was a personal aversion to coaching as the idea for a while for me, because I thought that it was entirely selfish. So I thought I thought coaching was something that was about figuring out myself for the purposes of myself.
Yeah.
And it was really being with the group of coaches through the climate coaching course. But more specifically, I would credit Peter Tavernese, my good friend, for kind of opening me up to this realization that, which also goes into the Buddhist understanding, which is the entire reason that we do all of that self-work is so that we can be helpful to others and other species. We are doing that work not for ourselves, but so that we can show up into the world and do the things that are most needed for us. And until we can be in that place where we realize what that contribution really is that we can make and continue to cultivate it, because there is no end point, as you said, we are shortchanging our ability to contribute to the broader world with whatever our gifts are. So I think that that was a really instrumental concept for me, that I had to kind of get over my own personal biases around what coaching represented, to recognize that it is really about coaching and the self-work is about service and stewardship in the end.
Yeah, which is, I mean, it's grounded in a person's true understanding of their basic human needs, which includes this nested social belonging. And so often when people misunderstand coaching, I think they misunderstand it because they're looking at it from the human exceptionalist lens, and whatever local exceptionalist lens is coming along with that. So, I've got to succeed so I can be cool, or have a lot of influence, or have a lot of money or something. And that's so insular, and that's not how the human need of belonging is met. And so it's when we understand what is that basic human need of belonging, then coaching becomes quite a social thing. I mean, yes, we're doing it, the internal work, but I mean, that's the same thing in a committed relationship, or in a relationship with your kids, or a relationship with your parents, or a relationship with a boss, or whatever. Like, you have to do your own work on your own inner self to show up and then be really nested in that relationship in a healthy way. So,
yeah, thank you. Yeah, love it. And I think that it's once I came to that understanding, I started to really notice the differences in the ways that certain people showed up and the ways that others showed up. And that was a huge, I would say that I went through the majority of my professional career not thinking about the ways that people showed up. They were just who they were in that moment. I wasn't thinking about the context by which they were making decisions or what work they had done to be there. I mean, there were certain people obviously that stood out as being certainly more illuminating than others, more supportive, more expansive, etc. But I couldn't have pinpointed before approaching this coaching work that, like, there's a reason that all of that manifests itself in that way. It's because they have invested in their own development in a way that enables them to show up in the world that way.
Yeah, absolutely. It's kind of funny because when people have asked me, younger people have asked me, so, you've studied psychology, you've been a psychologist for all these years, should I become a psychologist? I always say, if you love it and you're ready to sort of make the sacrifice, then do it. But remember that once you learn all this about how people behave, you can't unlearn it. So every relationship you have, then you see things that you might not want. It might be easier to not know, but you can't not know them because you already know. And so it's like, beware. But at the same time, I mean, it's a wonderful gift, and it's a wonderful privilege to be able to see those things and work with the people who are showing up in the way that you're saying, to be able to recognize it and to enhance it and to work co-creatively with it. I mean, it's then in those moments, and I'm like, yes, of course, do this work. It's fantastic, Yeah, but it's true. It comes with its own responsibilities.
Yeah, it does. I mean, I remember, just a quick anecdote. I remember during my MBA being in a consumer behavior course, and that there was a certain percentage of the class, the majority of the class, who were thinking, wow, like, this is a pretty powerful toolkit that I now have in order to manipulate behavior.
Yeah.
I was thinking to myself, they shouldn't be teaching this in business school without better ethics. And so here we sit in the world with lots of those instruments from psychology that have been developed over the past 100 years, that have been developed for greater understanding in the ways in which we can create meaning and purpose in the world, that are being manipulated into other systems, unfortunately.
Yeah, right. The knowledge is out there and can be used by anybody who obtains it. Yeah, which is more what's the word? More reason why we should try all to use it in the most positive way that we can, so that we're all working together, using that knowledge to move toward a more regenerative future, a more sustainable future.
Absolutely. Yes. And we're very lucky to have a number of people like yourself that have very strong psychology backgrounds, and particularly even clinical backgrounds, that have invested themselves hugely in this space, and devoted themselves entirely to it as well.
Yeah, I am so grateful for everybody who's doing the work and who has done the work in the past, because obviously, it didn't start with us. It started, as we were talking about the cultural amnesia aspect, started a long time ago. So many years and thousands of years, and we sort of keep going forward with the wisdom that we inherited. So it's an interesting place. It's an interesting cross section to be in terms of time, as we were talking about, time and how it relates to all of these things, and how each of us are showing up at this moment in time in relationship to time and what we do with our psychological time. I think a lot of people listening, maybe everybody who is listening now and who will listen, will probably take that away as one of the main points of what you've talked about. What we've talked about here is really maybe at least looking at, but maybe deconstructing to some degree, the relationship with time, and rebuilding that in a way that makes more sense given the future and what they want to bring into the future. You use this Barrett cultural values assessment in your in the organization in Solvable, and I think it's, when we think about visioning for the future, I think it's a very powerful tool. And as we think about how we use our time as well, I think it's a very powerful tool. So I just want to tell listeners about what it is and leave them with that in terms of how they could maybe take one next step to think about how they can start visioning things differently and how they can make time different, using their time differently, for this purpose. And then I'm going to leave the floor to you, and you're going to do a special little, what do we want to call it? Special little artistic piece for us, a reading for us. With all of these talks, I'm leaving the floor to the guest at the end, and you've prepared something special for us. So I'll let you explain that after. But the Barrett Cultural Values Assessment, that for people who aren't familiar with it, it's a corporate cultural assessment, and it asks people to look at their 10 highest personal values, and then they look at the 10 values that describe the organization currently, so the current culture of the organization, and then they look at the 10 values that describe their desired culture. And this is a really interesting way of moving through the visioning process, I think, because a lot of times with assessments, we stop at the what is your thing and what is their thing, and then that's it. So the binary. And then when you bring in this third thing, it brings you to an edge. What is the desired outcome? Oh, that's interesting. I think there's a lot of work, really good work being done in terms of visioning and learning how to reimagine the future. So I'm excited to see what's coming out, especially from like the degrowth movement and these kinds of things that are working with these like multiple paradigms that kind of come together to just give us new ways to imagine things. So I'm watching that space closely and seeing what comes out of that. And it'll be interesting, for me to explore with you as we see those things coming out and how it's affecting each of our spheres of work.
I'm really glad you brought it up, because just briefly, so the original architects working with Richard Barrett, where the CEO was Phil Clothier and Tor Inneroth, and we are currently working with them and trying to integrate the thinking around the next stage of that model and how it goes into different levels of consciousness. So how do the values relate across different levels of consciousness? And I think that what we're trying to do is match. They've been thinking a lot over years before we even started talking about how do these match across the UN SDGs, and now we're thinking specifically, how does this also interweave across the ESG metrics that organizations are looking at themselves? And I think the powerful model is that per what you were suggesting about the binaries, there's no right answers. It's a complete picture rather than, or an incomplete picture. That's the binary, not are you at a level 6 or are you at a level 7? And I think that is once again a complexity that is a different types of complexity that assessment framework offers than a lot of other ones that just kind of spit out the binary answers.
Yeah, right. Because I mean, it brings you to an edge, and it calls on your creativity. You can't just sit there and say, well, there's these 3 things and they don't go together. Okay, the end. I mean, your mind is necessarily like, okay, so what could be done? How can I adjust these things? There's always some room to maneuver. And so it asks you, okay, now you get involved. Now you get inspired.
Yes. And I think that this is the lens that we're going to see. I'm quite optimistic many companies embracing as we go forward, and they're really kind of moving from this transition from what started as kind of net zero commitments, which were very tangible commitments that could be quantifiably validated, that they really had no plans on how they were going to achieve, into ones that actually relate to a deeper sense of purpose and meaning in a larger, as you would say, operating ecosystem. And this is the space that I think is the really interesting space to watch, is how net zero and ESG, what we talk about is ESG 2.0, how these will emerge into different systems of knowing, being, and accountability, that started as something that I think is just straight out of the kind of corporate metric system that we've been living with for the past couple of decades, into a space of broadening collective action and responsibility. And it's very complex because you need people speaking the same language, and therefore that naturally goes towards the quantitative. But I think that there will be place for the qualitative to sit alongside the quantitative, and for us to begin measuring the things not by the intended measurement, which is relative to our past performance, but rather what is the thing that we're actually trying to contribute. And that's the really big, I think that's the really exciting space of this work in a corporate lens, is this next set of this emergence into a new set of metrics and understanding that is evaluating strategy and its effectiveness very differently than we would have looked at the kind of corporate responsibility CSR reporting that would have been done in the past 10 to 20 years.
Yeah, it's certainly a huge shift, and I'm super grateful for those of you who are living in that culture and working in it, because I left it in my 20s and said never again. So I'm really, really grateful. I mean, I do my work differently in a sort of different culture, but that's why I'm really grateful for those of you who are more made to withstand that on a daily basis and really contribute what you're contributing to it. I think it's really fantastic.
Amazing ecosystem of people all around the world working on these problems. Because they're big, but the dialogues, if for any listeners that are involved in these conversations within their organizations, and particularly within finance, there's so many consortia now that have formed per the collective conversation, where they can contribute with peers around these questions. In fact, we've started a new project, which is an amazing one, to define what are the competencies that are needed for the societal leader of the future. And this is an amazing project with the leading accreditor to business schools around the world. And we'll be working with organizations, once again, in a collective capacity to determine this kind of knowledge. And I think it's really heartening to see all of these kinds of collectives emerging, especially the ones that really move into those spaces of vulnerability with the group, that aren't just sitting around a board table deciding what they're going to put their signature on, but actually doing really, really hard work and questioning their own assumptions and working together to emerge into that future.
Yeah, that is a very exciting space. Yeah, that's great work. Yeah. Before we close, I want to make my one little note, because I realized, it's probably pretty obvious, but for somebody who's sitting there going, yeah, what does this cultural values assessment have to do with me again? I didn't say you would say the current culture in terms of the current culture you're living in, the current climate culture, the current, so what are your personal values? What are the values that you're living in terms of the current culture? I mean, of course, if you're in an organization, feel free to do it for your organization, but I was taking it in a more general way. And then what would be your desired, the values of your desired culture that you live in? That's the power of the exercise when you do it on a personal level. So just in case, I can just picture somebody saying, she said something that doesn't make any sense. So there, hopefully it makes better sense now.
Thank you.
Well, as usual, it's been super fantastic talking with you and hearing your nuances on these themes that we've previously discussed and now got to explore deeper. And it's always a pleasure. So thank you so much. And now I will leave the floor to you.
Thank you, Jen. It was great to chat with you as always, and huge learning space. And we knew we could go on for hours.
I know. I'm like, I don't want to end, but I mean, what should I ask from people? How long do they want to stay around?
Yeah, huge thank you to you, the Intergifted team, and everybody who watched. So I thought I would just close with a piece that was from the Understory issue, which is called Conversational Silence. So the domain for the Understory, if you want to subscribe, it's free. You're welcome to, is the understory.substack.com. And this is from a section that was based off of the British psychoanalyst work, Sally Weintraub, who has written a lot about the culture of care and uncare in our society. So I'm just going to share a little passage that was informed by her work. The state of uncare is not a natural one for humans or one necessarily shared by all cultures. Rather, it is a systemic and cultivated one in neoliberal economies that enrolls participation in an immoral project of exploitation, extraction, and consumption. We've become disassociated from the parts of ourselves that care by being encouraged to behave in ways that inflict harm. This awakening hurts. When I first came across Sally Weintraub's article about moral injury and the inflated climate bubble, I internally wept. To some degree, I blame myself for being so blind to the harms of my behavior. To live morally is to live fully in a way that is commensurate with all one's values. How could I have let this bubble be inflated around me that insulated me from the harm of my behavior to others and the planet? And then I came to realize that these are exactly the hypocrisies that Jay and Grant refer to in their book. Even those of us trying to be authentic and virtuous are inconsistent, as we are bundles of conflicting attitudes and desires. Renee Lertzman describes this as our ambivalence resulting from the competition of our desires within us. The ambivalence needs to be shared rather than masked. Sally Weintraub's writing reassured me that experiencing moral injury is a sign of mental health, not disorder. It means one's conscience is alive. Creating a culture of care within climate change conversation requires that we provide a narrative of forgiveness for ourselves and for others. In climate conversations, there's typically no absolution nor new beginnings. We are expected to shoulder our guilt, often without adequate support to process it, which causes most people to reject the entire moralistic package outright. Fred Luskin, the director of the Stanford University Forgiveness Project, defines forgiveness as a process of transforming the continuing and destructive feelings of guilt, blame, and anger into positive emotions such as empathy and reconstruction. Luskin found that forgiveness is a vital component of a comprehensive well-being. This means that not only should we be gentle on ourselves with our climate guilt as we face our moral injury, but we can approach climate conversations with others as spaces of forgiveness to offer resolution.
So beautiful. And I love that you chose that, because that was the one that I first found and I fell so in love with. So I wanted to tell listeners, if you're going to read one, if you're going to start somewhere, start with issue 22, Conversational Silence. It's a beautiful introduction, and this passage that you read is so powerful. Thank you.
Thank you, Jen. Thank you, everyone. Be well.
Bye, everybody. Bye.